this video, we're going to start to talk about workflows. Workflows in this orchestrator are built up of something called atomic actions. And you can think of atomic actions as kind of the Lego pieces that are used to build up these workflows. So when you were a kid, you built these great houses and castles out of Legos. You're kind of doing the same thing with workflows. You're using these pieces called atomic actions, which are listed here, as I said before, as the building blocks of workflows. So let's talk about how you do that and how we build these workflows. So what I'm going to do first is click on this icon here that says New Workflow. And you'll notice what it brings up is a blank palette over here that says Drag Activity here. And if I click anywhere over here, it's already set up, but you could see that on the right-hand side, I get properties. Now, without dragging any workflows or dragging any atomic actions over here into the workflow, I have what are the workflow properties. And these properties will exist over the entire workflow. As I drag some of these objects over to the right-hand side, you'll see I have the properties of those objects. And just one thing to note is that there's certain categories here, and they can all be dropped down just by clicking on that category. So for example, I'm going to show you a AWS service that will allow us to do something on AWS. So if I say I want to create a VPC on AWS, and I click on that Create VPC, now I get the properties of that VPC object. And you can see it's asking me for a name and an IP CIDR block for that VPC. Now, before we get into that, let's go back to the workflow properties by clicking on anywhere in this area that's not the action, and let's give it a name. So I'm going to call this Create VPC and Subnet. And what I'm going to do is go to the bottom where it says Target. And target means where you want to run these actions on. Now you can create it for the workflow, and if you create it for the workflow, you could tell each action to use the workflow's target. So if I click execute on this target for the workflow, and then choose AWS because these are AWS actions, and then I click the create VPC action, you'll see one of the options I have here is use workflow target. I can also override the workflow target. And the reason why we have that is because you may run 15 actions on AWS, but you also want to include something on maybe, Meraki or something else. And so you want to override it just for that action because it's not going to be sending that command over to AWS. So we have that option, but for the most part, what you want to do is make sure that in your workflow, and again, just click in an open area here, you want to set what most of your actions are going to be running against in this target here. So that way you don't have to set it every time. So let's go back to our action here. So we have create VPC. Now what I want to do is I want to give it a name. I'll call it new VPC. And I want to give it an IP address. And these are things that these are AWS specific and really outside of the scope of what we're trying to accomplish in the orchestrator, but I just want to show you how these actions work. You don't have to know any programming. You don't have to know any of that. All you have to do is drag an action over to the right and fill in this little information block right here. Now what I want to do is I want to create a VPC, and maybe I'll create a subnet under that VPC. So I'll click on the Create Subnet in VPC action, and I'll go down and I'll give it a name. I'll call it New Subnet. These are very creative names, I know. But now it's asking me for a VPC ID. And you only get a VPC ID in Amazon after you actually create the VPC. But the subnet needs to know that information. So in this workflow, luckily, you have this little puzzle piece object right here. And if I click on that, I can go to my activities, previous activity, which was Create VPC, and click on VPC ID and hit save. And what that did is it associated this field with the VPC ID of this action so that when this workflow's running and it executes this action, it'll also fill in this particular field when it's done running that activity so that it knows what that VPC ID is, and it will populate it there. So now I need a more specific block, so I'll put click 10.0/24, and it also is asking me for an availability zone. And a lot of these things you can fill in with variables, and we haven't gotten to that yet. So now you can see it's going to create a VPC, it's going to create a subnet, and we have these two things linked together. So we've basically created a program that we can use over and over again, but it's very specific right now. So this particular program has specific information. We can create new ones that actually ask and prompt for variables, and we're going to show that in a few seconds. So right now, in order to run this, you have to validate it first, and validate it means that it checks that these instructions are right, and then you could run the action. So then you just click run, and this would run. So let me look at another example here, which is a demo here. So here's a create WordPress, and this is a much more complicated demo. But what it does is it will actually create a DB instance within Amazon. It'll go down and check for that this instance is working. And once it's available, then it will actually create a database on that instance, and it will install WordPress in actually Google Cloud Platform. So this showcases that you don't have to use one particular platform, but you could actually use them all together. Now, what you notice here on the right-hand side is I have a bunch of inputs here, and these inputs are filled in by various variables. So in this create DB instance, if I click on this, you'll see that it wants to be filled in by an input. An input variable is something that will prompt. So it'll ask for the DB name, it'll ask for the username and the password. So what you'll see is when I actually run this, you'll see that it's asking or prompting the user to fill in certain information before it runs. So very powerful in that you don't have to hard code the information. You can just prompt the user for that information. One thing about these workflows too that I'd like to mention is they don't always have to be run here. They can actually be run here. They could be run from an API call within the orchestrator. And you can see in the API documentation, there is something that says workflow start. This will actually trigger it and show you how to trigger specific workflows right from here. So we could trigger it that way. We could also trigger it from a RabbitMQ, from a Kafka bus, from an email. So there's multiple ways to trigger these workflows. So the whole concept of these workflows, though, and to go back into it, is that you just drag these objects over. And you're able to create complex logic around these workflows by just dragging objects and creating interactions between them. You also have a complete list of logic, things like for each loops, condition blocks, breaks, parallel blocks. So you have all that stuff in here just like a typical programming language. The other things to know is that you also have ways to parse your data from core objects and to manipulate your data. And you can also parse JSON into tables by using these table objects here. So this is just an introduction into workflows. We're going to get into more advanced workflows in the following tutorials.